we're still dealing with the idea of moving spirits that are moving particular flows of force through particular places in order to manifest particular natures and particular things. And so we can call upon the elemental spirits to help with the physical shaping of how that is playing out.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to another edition of the Glitch Bottle Podcast, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are talking about living spirits, grimoires, Solomonic magic, and so much more with author and magician, Mr. B.J. Swain. B.J. Swain stopped by the podcast to discuss his tome, Living Spirits, a guide to magic in a world of spirits, which is a comprehensive journey through the practical and academic topography of the grimoire tradition, as well as exploring scrying, working with ancestors, the four kings associated with the four cardinal directions, elemental spirits, the holy guardian angel, and so much more. BJ began studying and practicing magic as a young boy, and he committed to deepening that study and to practice as a teenager and young adult. He's a priest in the Gnostic Catholic Church, deputy master of an OTO body, and involved in at least 2 other occult organizations. He studies and approaches traditional systems of magic for both practicality and academic examinations, and BJ currently writes the blog Glory of the Stars and the website The Unveiled Sky. In this first part of a 2-part discussion with BJ, he shares about his background, the pitfalls of materialism, the effect of the Protestant Reformation on magical endeavors, the relationship between exorcism and conjuration, the difference between Solomonic work versus more devotional work, the 4 kings and their relationship to granting spiritual access, the elementals, and much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you part 1 of our conversation with B.J. Swain. B.J. Swain, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle Podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm super excited about this.
Well, the honor is certainly mine, BJ, and I know several listeners have shared with me about their feedback on Living Spirits, a guide to magic in a world of spirits. Can you share with us a little bit, BJ, about how did you first get interested in magic and in the esoteric world?
I don't really remember a time where I wasn't interested in magic. From the time I was a small child, like when you go to wishing wells as a kid, or when you wish upon a star, that was always my wish, was to be great at magic someday. And it was just something that was sort of always around. There were a couple moments growing up that I didn't realize were unusual until I got to college and talked to my friends, and they were like, yeah, no, our parents didn't show us that. Like when I was about probably 4 or 5 years old, my dad taught me to dominate animals by gazing at them in order to deal with stray dogs in the neighborhood. And before I started first grade, he taught me to do the same to my teachers to make sure they paid attention to me. And so there was always a sort of this element of magic that was kind of always on the cusp of being there. And from the time I was very little, I would see and interact with spirits. And so probably about the time I was 6 or 7, started working with nature spirits to try and figure out magic, because I just had this sense that it must be there, that it must be something where if you just sort of understood the underlying nature of how the world was built and what the sort of keys to unlock those controlling powers in the world were, then you'd be able to execute magic. And so just kind of being around things in nature, listening to them, talking to them, trying to figure out how to interact with them to get them to do things. Those were kind of my first steps in magic. And from there, it just became something where I was always driven to find it in a more formal sense. And around middle school, I read a fictional book where a kid found a book of magic, and he and his friends started experimenting with it. And it just, actually, I guess it was late elementary school, really. And it dawned on me that, oh, there must be books on this somewhere. Like, if there's magic out there, people have probably written about it. And so I would go out to the bookstore with my dad, and I would kind of sneak off and look around the store until I found the sections that had books on magic. And one day he saw me looking at them and was like, "Are you interested in this?" And so he bought me my first book of magic around 5th or 6th grade or so. And it just kind of all went from there. Then right after I turned 18, like maybe 2 months after turning 18, I joined in an AA lineage and began training with my mentor. And then eventually that led to getting involved in the OTO and deepening my exploration of other magical things. But I had a whole host of people through the online community when I was a teenager who taught me and showed me things and helped expand my knowledge and my access to information. So I was very lucky in that regard, I think.
Was it kind of a balance for you in terms of like the kind of natural, instinctual feelings that you had for the esoteric coupled with academia and esoteric orders, or how did that whole thing play out?
Very much so. They kind of dovetailed, especially in the beginning. A lot of my experience growing up, there were little bits and pieces of things that I got from my parents. There were bits and pieces of things I got from working with spirits and from just kind of experimenting and trying things based on instinct. There was a point where I would pray to God for him to send his angels to show me things or send sort of divine force down to teach me and help guide me in these magical pursuits. And then it was right around the time that it became something that was a much more active, involved pursuit through prayer and meditation that I started exploring things through books. And it was interesting because as a child in the 90s, the books that were easy to get were mostly books that were of a Neo-Pagan background. And so it was very much the energy model of magic and dealing with visualization and thought forms. And it was very similar to a lot of what I was already doing through instinctual work and through prayer work. And so they fit together very well, and it kind of expanded on and gave structure and form to a lot of what I was already trying to figure out on my own. Around the time that I hit about 15 or so, then I started kind of moving out of that Neo-Pagan way of looking at things and simultaneously started exploring more Reconstructionist and traditional pagan outlets for things, as well as starting to explore more ceremonial and Kabbalistic approaches. And one of the things I was super interested in at the time was conjuration of spirits and working with grimoires and working that sort of model of magic that got kind of referenced here and there in books, but no one really explained or talked about in most of them. And at the time, there weren't really books on the subject. There was Konstantinos' Summoning Spirits, which I never ended up getting a copy of or reading, but there wasn't much of anything for people to point people in a direction of, because the only real grimoires that were easily available when I was a teenager were the Mather's version of the Key of Solomon, and I think not even a full Lemegeton. I think it was just the Goetia that was available at the time. Ironically, my mentor had published a full edition of the Lemegeton, but it was like a self-published thing that had only been available in California, and so I didn't have a copy of it till I was about 19. Around that time, I think there was probably another version or two that had become available. But a lot of the older grimoire publications that had happened in like the 70s and 80s weren't available anymore, and they were things that people had never really written much about. So that was actually one of my thoughts in putting together Living Spirits, was what would I have wanted to see in a book when I was getting started with trying to explore conjuration and explore working with spirits? How did I think something like that should look as far as getting someone started? Kind of creating what hadn't been there for me when I was younger. Of course, now there are a lot more books and a lot more resources talking about that, because there's been this huge boom in people exploring more traditional forms of spirit magic, mostly thanks to Rufus and Jake Stratton-Kent and Jason Miller and Aaron Leach. But even at that, I think it's still few and far between the books that really tie things together and make things very open and accessible in a sense that is practical, but also explains how the history and the language and the progression of different cultural elements all impact and flow together to tie together these apparently disparate manners of working.
You opened the book by talking about, and borrowing a phrase from Gordon White, who's fantastic, about how we live in a spirit-haunted world. Can you kind of talk about this? Because especially in light of, for lack of a better phrase, modernity and kind of the psychological model of apprehending reality, why do you think we kind of fell away from this sensitivity to spirits in general? And what do you think we can do to kind of rectify that?
I think we have a perception that we've removed ourselves from that or fallen away from an awareness of it. But I think some of it is that we don't know how to engage it. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't have a language for discourse regarding our interactions with spirits. But I think there's a lot more research in contemporary folklore fields and in fields of anthropology that are exploring more contemporary modern culture and the first world, as opposed to just exploring cultures that look more like something that we're no longer connected to, where we're starting to see that people still have interactions with the spirit world, people still encounter the fair folk, people still encounter the dead, and it's something where a belief in that is not as gone or as suppressed as people sometimes assume it is. And the idea that people, even in the United States and in Britain and the more powerful and advanced countries in Europe, there's an assumption that people in those places are completely disconnected from that. But there's still times where people have these experiences. They're just not things that they necessarily talk about or they know how to engage. And I think partially because we don't know how to engage those experiences and we don't know how to remain open to them and how to dig in and reach our hands into the depths of what's possible there. That's why sometimes these experiences seem fleeting or they seem minor or they seem to just be moments of confusion that people have. And I think as we return to having a greater facility of being able to speak about and explore and express what our experiences are, then that will help people learn not only how to communicate and share them, and it'll give greater understanding, but that greater understanding will also create a greater openness and give us more means to intentionally and with purpose try to engage those experiences in those parts of reality. Because if we look at cultures that still have that, many of those cultures have many of the same modern things that we have, but they have what Gordon has sometimes called better magic. They have bigger experiences of the spirit world, more constant and consistent experiences of the spirit world, because they still know how to talk about it, they still know how to engage it, they still know how to weave it into the rest of their lives. Whereas for us, it's something that's kind of there, but people are a little embarrassed to acknowledge sometimes, and so it stays something that we try to push away, we try to keep separate. But I don't think it's something that we've ever fully lost. I think it's just something that we need to understand how to have.
I know for many listeners out there, sometimes we might think that the advent of ceremonial magic might be something with, traditionally we think about the PGM and the migration up to the Byzantine Empire and then into Europe. But on page 21 of your book, Living Spirits, you reference from the 8th century BC an actual spell that survives in incomplete forms in both Assyrian and Akkadian, where it says, quote, "The wicked god, the wicked demon, the demon of the desert, the demon of the mountain, the demon of the sea, the demon of the marsh, the evil genius, the enormous uruku, the bad wind by itself, the wicked demon which seizes the body, which disturbs the body, spirit of the heavens, conjure it, spirit of the earth, conjure it," unquote. And you are documenting here, BJ, basically a spell that calls upon divine figures to bind the spirit, which of course in different forms survives right up until the present day, and certainly with many of the grimoires. So can you talk about this kind of, for people who may be a little apprehensive, like, is this reconnection to magic a new thing, quote unquote? I mean, this is as old as recorded history.
Right, and I think we can even... Part of my academic background is in ancient history, and so I'm very cautious about what I will say about things that are prehistoric. But I think that we do have archaeological evidence to support the idea that forms of magic like this existed prior to what our written history shows for us. But certainly from the beginning of written history, we have examples that really tie together and show forms of magical practice that have come down straight into the 19th century, where there's almost an unbroken chain of this concept. And it's not something that we can say is purely a Western or European ideal, because we have in just the very dawn of civilization. These same ideas being worked, these ideas that one spiritual power can be called upon to impact another spiritual power, and that those other spiritual powers impact our lives and impact our experience, and that by understanding what spiritual powers impact us and what spiritual powers those can be impacted by, we can make changes in our lives and our experience. I think that's something that is ubiquitous to mankind. I think we would be hard-pressed to find a culture that doesn't have some form of that. And I think even in a fairly materialist context, people still have some sense or belief in that, even if it's not something that they're ready to necessarily connect to or ready to necessarily consciously acknowledge that they believe in. There's still points where people are cautious about what they will and will not touch because of what the implications of that could be for how it could impact their luck or their karma or whatever they want to call it. But they're recognizing that there's some sort of spiritual influence there. There's some invisible cause, as Paracelsus would say.
You, BJ, in your book Living Spirits, write about materialism and basically kind of urging readers to just be aware of that and be a little bit on guard about the materialistic viewpoint. So what is it about the materialistic viewpoint specifically that could potentially be damaging or limiting for someone looking to practice magic?
Well, I think that when we start to engage in unchecked materialism, or we start to engage in things like scientism, then we start to try to codify the world in a way which takes away anything that we can't immediately see, quantify, measure with our more material senses. And I think it's very obvious that there are things in our experience and in our day-to-day experience, not even necessarily spiritual things, but things that just move in the world and move in ourselves and our own psyches, that are not things that are fully measurable or fully observable. So just from that perspective, the idea of having a purely materialist view is clearly one where we're accepting a false view. I think from a perspective of attempting to engage the spirit world and attempting to engage magic, that type of materialism asks us to turn off awareness to anything else, asks us to turn off belief in anything else. And so even as we experience things that are, from a materialist viewpoint, inexplicable, then rather than try to open our awareness to an explanation, we're told to dismiss those things and assume that it's some sort of flight of fancy, and that regardless of what evidence there is, that there's some sort of consistent pattern, or there's something where there's some sort of causal element that, because it's not as easily quantifiable and observable, we shouldn't accept it as part of our reality. And I don't think that we get to necessarily pick and choose reality in the way that materialism wants us to.
Was that something that, BJ, in your own individual magical practice, did you naturally kind of arrive at that conclusion, or did you yourself kind of initially come to formal, ceremonial, grimoiric magical practice with some of these own subconscious resistances and that you had to overcome, or was it more natural to accept it, or how did that whole thing play out for you?
I think because I grew up with kind of a connection to the spirit world and a connection to magic, I never developed that sort of purely materialist view that often gets talked about in magic books, where it's like, oh, you've got to learn to turn off your mind functioning this way, you've got to learn to turn off this ingrained belief system, or that after a certain age we are taught to stop believing in magic and stop believing in the unseen. And I never really went through a phase of stopping believing. And so I didn't have to go through and try to reprogram myself. And sometimes when people talk about that process, or talk about having to work around these things that are hard to understand and hard to grasp because it's so outside of what our normal waking experience is, I don't always get to that because I didn't go through it in that same way. But I do think, having gone through education in modern ceremonial magic, there definitely were points where I tried to approach things structuralized in certain ways and tried to explore how the psychological model could work, how the different models could work as separate things, but never liked the idea of them as being separate. And so always sort of tried to work with them as a singular, holistic approach to existence. But there were still times definitely where I tried to categorize things in it's got to be this or it's got to be that. And I think that is definitely something that comes out of our modern contemporary view. But sometimes going back to that older, more religious or spiritual conception of reality where it's like, well, just sometimes things are just real, and sometimes they can be real in more than one way. And sometimes things that seemingly contradict each other can both be real at the same time. As we start to understand that the universe doesn't have the same material restrictions in all cases that we tend to perceive in our day-to-day lives, then we start to open ourselves up to realizing greater possibilities of how the spirit world and how magic can work, because something can be more than one thing at a time. Something can exist in more than one way at a time, and multiple things can be true and can be explanations for something, but they explain it on different levels or they explain it in different ways, and they add different elements of meaning so that whether they fit together perfectly or not matters a lot less.
You also write about this kind of, during the Protestant Reformation, there's this kind of concretizing of reality in terms of a binary of good and evil, and we think of the King James Bible. And can you just kind of share, like, what influence did that have, the Protestant Reformation, both on Catholic, Protestant influences? What did that do to grimoiric research and practice?
The impact on history and civilization in Europe and the Americas of the Protestant Revolution is something that is probably incalculable. Because even within Catholicism went through this huge counter-reformation where it tried to make itself more palatable and more acceptable in a world that now embraced Protestantism. So I think we can definitely see in a lot of cultures where Catholicism remained and continued the sorts of practices and worldviews and ideas that we would often associate with earlier pre-Protestant Catholicism. But Protestantism, it's so sort of bizarre and intricate how its impact works, because at the same time that you have Protestantism creating things like the Rosicrucian movement and giving us things like the Arbitel, the Protestant movement also wanted to strip away the concept of the saints. It wanted to strip away any sort of icons. It wanted to strip away the idea of art and beauty as ways of understanding and exploring the divine. And as you move deeper and deeper into Protestant movements, you start to get to where Christianity becomes almost a social club. And that's something where I've had Protestant friends who've explained that that's their experience of their church, is that it's a way to network, it's a way to meet people, it's a way to have a community, and it gives sort of a moral guideline, but that it's not really about necessarily engaging into these spiritual elements. On the flip side of that, though, as Protestantism continued to develop and evolve, I think there was a recognition that people still needed that. And then you get some of the movements of Christianity that were tied to the early New Thought movement in the United States, and then the development of the evangelical movements and the Pentecostals. You start to have what I sometimes describe as witchcraft Christianity, where you have these versions of Christianity that have these very folk spiritual engagements where people are touching on deep spiritual powers, but don't necessarily have any kind of real traditional structure around which to describe them. And so it becomes this very free and moving type of thing. But I think the major impact on magic and on spirituality that Protestantism initially had is that it began to say that the world shouldn't be superstitious. The world shouldn't look at things as having this dynamic spiritual presence, and that all of these things which are part of the greater mythos of Christianity and of Catholic experience are things that are just false, and that these are things that were ideas or metaphors, but are not things that are actual parts of reality. And so you start to get the idea that the vexation of a demon isn't that there's an actual spirit that's vexing you, but simply that you have some sort of psychological ailment like alcoholism, and that ailment can be dealt with through prayer because that prayer helps center you and ground you, but that there's not actually really some afflicting force or afflicting power that's causing the ailment, because those afflicting powers and those afflicting forces don't exist. They're just stories. So I think Protestantism kind of laid the groundwork for that materialist structure. and started to tell people that they needed to move towards that. I think in terms of creating a more binary appearance of good and evil, I think in a more Catholic worldview, there's a lot more space for shades of gray. You have things where even spirits that are supposed to be the negative adversarial spirits have room for behaving in ways that can be good, or they could have desire to return back to their original station. Whereas Protestantism sort of strips out any of those spirits from existing and really basically just takes the idea that there's God, there's Jesus, there's Satan, and that's all that you really need. You don't need a whole world that moves through a whole hierarchy of the infernal up through the worldly into a whole hierarchy of the heavenly. It's just something where there's not space for in most mainline Protestantism. And of course, you do get some forms of Protestantism like Anglicanism, or in the United States, Episcopalianism, and some forms of Lutheranism that are much more Catholic in their nature. And so they still have some space for things like that. And then, of course, there were the more mystically inclined versions of Protestantism that engaged in various types of magical and meditative and even sometimes sexual practices that were meant to awaken spiritual elements of a person's nature. So it wasn't always something where Protestantism looked like Methodism or Presbyterianism or Calvinism, but it was definitely something where that whole movement and that whole shaping and changing of the landscape in Europe, not just religiously, but intellectually and politically, is something that very much changed kind of the structure of how people thought of the world and how people were allowed to think of the structure of the world. If we look at England in particular, when we look at the idea of witchcraft in England, it really shows us that witchcraft was not about some revival of ancient paganism or some continuation of an ancient pagan priesthood. The anti-witchcraft laws were basically laws against Catholic forms of magic in England. And there was a sense of a conspiratorial element during the Reformation in England where Catholic priests and Catholic magicians would be working against nobility and factions of the government that were pushing for Protestantism, or if there was a Protestant monarch working against them. And so laws were put in place in order to limit those magical practices, in order to limit the use of magic as a form of sedition. And when we start looking at the practices of witchcraft during the witch trials in England and in the extended portions of Britain, it's not precisely like it was in the continent, because Britain, of course, had it for a shorter period of time, but the people that they were trying were people who were practicing Catholic folk practices, using pieces of Catholic prayers, using pieces of Catholic Latin, and were working with spirits, but they were working with them in a way that they thought was part of their overall folk Catholic worldview, and that was the worldview that they wanted to return to. So within that Catholic worldview, there was space for that. There was space for talking to the dead. There was space for talking to the fairies. There was space for working with the aerial spirits or working with the angels. And that was something that, as Protestantism moved in and took over, and we can see this very much in Discovery of Witchcraft, where different types of magic are referred to as being popish, or basically as being Catholic, because Catholic was sort of a synonym with superstitious at that point.
You know, some of the traditional things that Protestantism might look at and say, well, this is borderline idolatry, you know, this, like things like incense, like having a litany of the saints, things like making sure to use holy water to consecrate things, that all of these things dismissed by some aspects of Protestantism as being kind of borderline idolatry, yet when one looks at the, you know, Sworn Book of Honorius or the Heptameron or the Lemegetans Goetia, as you write extensively about, these things are almost integral, not necessarily Catholic, quote unquote, but just integral to fulfilling the mutually agreed upon terms via the contract, so to speak, of the grimoire itself between the operator and the spirit. So these things are pretty integral to practicing grimoire magic.
And I think that these things are also things that, up until the point of the Reformation, were things that were just standard religious practice, not just for Catholicism, but for the world in general. When you look at what we know of temporal religion in Rome or in Greece or in Egypt or in the Near East, and what we know of religions in other more Far Eastern cultures, a lot of similar practices, a lot of similar accoutrements are things that we see fairly consistently showing up there, because there's something about these things that speaks to the spirit world, just like you're saying. And they were things that, when we look at religion and magic, it's kind of hard to say that they're fully separate, but it's also hard to say that they're ever quite the same. Magic, in many cases, is almost illicit religion, even in times where magic is somewhat acceptable. I think one of the things that the Reformation does is it takes a lot of these things that were fairly standard religious practice, but were part of the magic of the time, and by trying to remove them from religion, it kind of occultifies those things that were magical, that were part of the Catholic worldview. And so, like, when we look at Liber Juratus, it makes a very big deal to kind of assert itself as being just standard Catholicism, and that there's a perception that some of the things that it's doing are things that shouldn't be allowed or things that are bad, but it tries to explain itself as a more correct version of Christianity. And I think there was space for that at that point when it was written, but we go a couple hundred years later to where we're starting to strip out a lot of these things from religion. Then the idea of saying these long prayers and going through all of these steps and burning this incense and burning these candles and having these formalized rituals are things where it all starts to look superstitious and starts to look occult. And it's kind of interesting that after a certain point, it becomes almost purely that, whereas before that point, it was something where the line between what was something that was occult and what was something that was part of the mainstream religion is one that's a lot blurrier. If we look at, like, the history surrounding the Cambridge Book of Magic, the practices in that book are things that are very similar to what we see in a lot of other grimoires. But we can also see that most likely that book was assembled by someone who was working as a priest in a monastery, and the things that he was doing were things that were not uncommon for priests to be aware of or for priests to be experimenting with. And so there's definitely things in there that are outside the bounds of standard religious practice, but then there are things in there that are tied to standard religious practice as well. And so a lot of what we have as far as examples of magic in that pre-Protestant period, or at least of learned magic, or more formal forms of magic, are things that are tied to clergy and tied to church personnel. And so it gets a lot more difficult to try and extricate those things from what the mainstream religion was.
That's such a great point. Dr. Richard Kickheffer in Forbidden Rites in the introduction has this beautiful metaphor about a tapestry and how religion is kind of like the front side of the tapestry, but if you were ever seen the back of a tapestry, you can still see the outline and the design of the front, but it's the back and how kind of the occult practices, these kind of quote-unquote forbidden rites that he talks about with CLM 849, kind of mirror religion. And to your point, BJ, one of the most fantastically outrageous and amazing and beautiful claims in the Sworn Book of Honorius in the introduction is that, and this goes to your point about the separation between magic and religion, or not so separate, and I'd love your thoughts on it, is the intro itself in the Sworn Book talks about how the effort to preserve magic is actually a very good, noble, and effectively Catholic thing, and that the forces against that were actually Catholic clergy who, according to the Sworn Book of Honorius, were being influenced by demonic forces, and that the ability to compile and bury this book and have an oath-bound book was a way to kind of counteract that. I mean, it just kind of speaks to your point about how, like, religion and magic are extremely closely tied.
I've always found that element of the Juratus story to be very interesting when looking at things from a contemporary magic perspective, because in Thelema, within the mythos that the AA has built up for itself, there's this concept of the great sorcery, where this idea that a group of initiates, a group of people who understood magic and mysticism and power, decided that that was something that other people shouldn't have, and that they worked the great sorcery in order to try and hide the truth from everyone. And that Christianity, as a mainstream institutional religious structure, is sort of the the manifestation of that great sorcery, that it's a way of hiding reality and hiding the truth from people and hiding their ability to find who they are and what their purpose and what their power is. And Liber Juratus is presenting sort of a very similar idea, that there's a movement within the clergy to try and hide and remove and strip away all of this, but then there's another movement within the clergy to try to preserve and keep all of it. And I think one thing that's really interesting about that perspective, that these magical practices that Liber Juratus is trying to preserve are things that are holy and are part of pure and correct Christianity, as opposed to some sort of aberration of Christianity, is this idea that rather than magic being something where people are wresting power away from the divine or using elements of how the universe is set up to kind of trick spiritual forces into doing what they want and undermining the divine plan, Yuval Harari, who did a translation of the Sword of Moses and wrote a book on Jewish magic prior to the Kabbalah, talks about the idea that God is the God of magic, and that part of God's design for mankind was for mankind to have access to these magical powers, and for God to grant to people the names and seals and keys that were needed in order to command spirits and call down angels and have the angels do things for man, and to subdue demons and have the demons work in a way that is necessary for man. And if we look at the Testament of Solomon, we see that story play out in the Testament of Solomon. Solomon encounters a spirit abusing a child, and his solution is to pray to God. And God sends wisdom to him and sends with the Archangel Michael a ring that is the sign of that wisdom, and basically the Holy Spirit. And that through that, he's able to command the initial demon, and then through that demon, call upon the others and command and bind those other demons. And so it's through divine providence that Solomon's able to do this. It's not through some sort of trickery or guile on his part. And I think this is something that is fairly consistent through Judeo-Christian magical tradition, that there's an element of this where it's built into the system. It's built into the way the universe is created, that mankind is supposed to have access to this. And this is another way of man exploring his relationship with God and exploring his relationship with the spiritual natures underneath divinity.
You dedicate an entire chapter to conjuration specifically. And for the listeners out there who kind of understand the basics about grimoire traditionalism and the Solomonic method, can you give us what is conjuration at its base, and how is conjuration historically different and yet similar to exorcism, since we've mentioned the church? Just what is the entire concept behind working with and engaging and conjuring spirits?
Well, conjuration is the idea that we can call upon a spirit, and by applying certain divine names that spirit is responsive to, or by applying the names of certain spiritual powers that spirit is responsive to, that we can bind the spirit to a particular behavior. And so that behavior can be in the form of binding it to appear in a certain way in a certain place and answer questions. It can be in the way of binding it to a particular act, or it can be binding it in a pact with ourselves in which there's some sort of exchange. In terms of the relationship of exorcism and conjuration, initially the concepts were synonymous. There was no real difference between the idea of conjuration and exorcism. Conjuration is basically with the force of law or with the force of jurisdiction. And so we are taking that divine or that spiritual jurisdiction or that divine or spiritual law or authority, and we're using that as a way to bind the spirit. Exorcism is to bind by means of oath. And so oaths specifically by means of swearing upon the name of a particular divine power. So in exorcism, we're still using names and signs in order to call upon a spirit, bind the spirit to behave in a particular way, bind the spirit to interact in a particular way, and to do the things that we need the spirit to do. Now, when we start to think of them as separate from a religious and a magical perspective, conjuration becomes something that we associate more with the active process of calling upon a spirit and inviting the spirit in to interact with us so that we can bind the spirit to go do things that we need or to answer questions for us. whereas exorcism becomes associated with the idea of binding a spirit to remove a spirit that's vexing or afflicting someone. But in this idea of religion and magic overlapping and interweaving, or that concept that you mentioned of a tapestry where we see the front of the tapestry, but on the back side of the tapestry there's this other related image. When we look at some of the rules about exorcism in the church, there was a point where they started adding in instructions for exorcists that they weren't supposed to ask the demon questions. They weren't supposed to engage with the demon or the spirit that was afflicting someone, because priests quickly realized that if they were binding these spirits and they gained the name of the spirit and they had the names and the powers referenced to control the spirit, then they could interact with the spirit, they could ask the spirit questions, and they could learn things about the spiritual reality that they wanted to know but didn't have access to otherwise. I think there was a large part, both amongst clergy and then later amongst your gentleman magicians, that magic was there as a means of gaining knowledge beyond what could be gained through the normal system of education and study at the time. And exorcism, while it was something that was an almost medical procedure, something that was there to remove these afflicting powers, it was still something that overlapped with magical practice. And these priests that would have performed exorcisms would have also been the priests that had knowledge of these magical modes of conjuration. And so it wasn't a far jump for them to realize that once they've basically bound the spirit before they remove it from someone, they could ask the spirit to answer questions, or they could ask the spirit to go do things for them. And so the church began putting in instructions for exorcists not to do that, under the assumption that it was dangerous because these spirits would lie and mislead people. Most likely also that it created greater risk for the demoniac because they were being subjected to the experience of possession longer while the priest went through this process of questioning. And I think that's where we start to see the ideas separate out more, that exorcism in more modern parlance tends to refer specifically to the idea of removing a vexing spirit, whereas conjuration refers to the magical practice. But historically, the two words were, one was the Greek word, one was the Latin word.
So effectively, you had these priests in the Middle Ages who, I don't want to say rediscovering, that might be too forceful, too strong of a word, but effectively stumbling upon or coming across the Solomonic method and basically saying, wait a second, we could actually ask these spiritual entities questions and via a binding and interrogation procedure actually find things out. And then that's when the Catholic Church kind of came in, and the Church of the ecclesiastical authorities saying, nope, this is just spiritual movement. You are exercising, you are moving the spirit away from the possessed person. Would that be fair or accurate?
Definitely. And I think we can also see that when we look at how modern magicians have approached certain types of ancient magic, the Stelae of Jew, the hieroglyphs, or the headless invocation or the bornless invocation. Originally, that is an apotropaic exorcism. The idea is that the exorcist is calling upon these divine powers in order to gain the authority, in order to expel the spirit that is afflicting someone. And so there are routinely passages that go back to the idea of binding and removing and sending away the spirit and its vexations. When that particular text became part of modern magic with the Golden Dawn, they made adjustments to it and focused on the idea of the text being used to gain power over all spirits. And so the section that talks about every spirit on the earth and under the earth, in the air, in the rushing whirling waters and rushing fires, and every spell and scourge of God being made obedient unto me, that becomes the refrain in the ritual, but it wasn't in the original version. And so it becomes something that's focused on subduing spirits for the purpose of being able to conjure them. And then Crowley uses it as the preliminary invocation for spirit conjuration. The Golden Dawn and Crowley also use it as an invocation for the Holy Guardian Angel, because the function the Holy Guardian Angel has in that system, and then also in the original Abramelin system, is one that involves sort of being a general thwarting angel and being able to command and draw in these spirits and assist the magician in working with them. We see there where we have an example where a ritual goes from being a ritual of just expelling these spirits to being a ritual of being able to command these spirits. And so it's that same process, but in this case occurring over a period of 1,500 years to 2,000 years, with clergy engaging in that shift. That's something where I don't think there's necessarily a process fully of them having to rediscover it as much as something where it was just kind of there and sort of overlapped what they were already doing.
BJ, to that point, Chapter 5 in your book, you dedicate an entire chapter to the concept of devotion. And I'd love if you could kind of get into this, because you say, quote, on page 47, quote, "You'll see a lot of magicians, even those claiming to work in a pure traditional context, who post pictures online of their devotional offerings or altars lit up with candles while doing devotional work to the Olympic spirits or to the angels of the planets. This is probably a fulfilling part of their work, but it isn't traditional in Solomonic work." What is devotion? Can it be synergistically used to amplify grimoire, traditional ceremonial magical work? Is it completely separate? What is devotion all about?
Okay, I think that's a really great question. In terms of being separate from Solomonic tradition, I think something that is important for people to understand is that the grimoire traditions in general, not just the Solomonic ones, because, of course, there are many grimoires that are not Solomonic, is something that up until we hit probably about, I would say, like the 14th, 15th century, we're looking at something that's fairly set in a Catholic worldview. And in a Catholic worldview, the idea of having devotional work to angels, it's something that we see somewhat in folk Catholicism, but it's also something that the church actively worked against and tried to limit which angels had names in order to limit the propensity for people to try and create these devotional cults towards the angels. It was definitely something where you wouldn't be doing that with any of the infernal spirits. There was maybe some room for with working with the saints, but even there, the church had to try to sometimes limit the cults of the saints because they felt that it became too dominant of a practice. It was something that was too close to what people were used to in their historical cultural memories. And so these devotional practices, I think, are something that are very natural. They're something that are very meaningful. It's something that people need, but it's not something that the grimoires attest at all, because it wouldn't have been part of the worldview. It probably would have gotten people in trouble. But I do think it's something that's important. And personally, I do devotional work with my ancestors. I do devotional work with saints and with certain gods. I don't really do it with the angels, but there are still angels where I have kind of an ongoing familiarity with from working with them repeatedly. And there's definitely interactions where I will make offerings in Thanksgiving for things that they've done or helped me with, but not so much where I'd call an angel and just make an offering to that angel for the fact that it's an angel and it's a pretty cool guy and I want to give it some wine today. But for people who they want to work with the angels in that context, again, it can be a fairly important way to go. I think what the devotional work does for us, aside from filling something that is an innate human need, it allows us to kind of ground those powers in our world and in our lives. I think some element of spirits being able to work in the world, and this is going to depend a little bit on the type of spirit and where the spirit resides, is the access that we as people give them by the way that we engage them. And so the more routinely we're engaging them, the more we're grounding them into our lives, the more we're grounding them in the presence around us, the more able they are to work in the world around us. And I think another element of where this becomes beneficial is, I imagine a lot of your listeners have probably seen The Mummy, not like the old Universal Studios one from back in like the 30s, but the one from the 90s with Brendan Fraser. There's a scene in there where the guy who kind of is like the con artist tour guide, he encounters the resurrected mummy and he pulls out all of the different religious icons and he tries to go through one, waiting for one of them to work. And finally, there's one where the mummy recognizes it. And so he responds, but it's not in the way that the guy wants him to respond. And we see that as a trope that comes up in a lot of fiction where people try to use like some sort of religious icon to deal with a spirit or deal with a monster. And because the person doesn't have a connection or a belief in that icon, then nothing happens. And so I don't think it purely works that way, but I think the more we're engaging with these spirits and engaging with these spiritual powers, the more inclined they are to work with us. And so if we're calling upon saints, or we're calling upon our ancestors, or we're calling upon different divine forces to work with us in how we manage our interaction with the spirit world, then the more those spirits know us, and the more those spirits have familiarity with us and a regular interaction with us, the more inclined they are to work with us, which is where these systems that have initiation into particular lineages of working with spirits, that's where that initiation becomes important, because it's a way of introducing people to those spirits and giving them access to those spirits. It's something that we see in biblical stories where people try to buy apostolic power, but then the spirits don't recognize those people. They'll recognize the names they're using, but they don't recognize the person as having access to those names because there's no real relationship there. I think devotion is a way of building that relationship.
You touch, BJ, just now and in Living Spirits in your latest work on spiritual access. And you dedicate really hefty, really powerful amount to the four kings. What or who are the four kings? And can you talk about how this relates to this concept of spiritual access and like allowing the engagement with other spiritual entities?
Well, I think the four kings are interesting because depending on what sources we're looking at, the way they're treated varies somewhat. Even the assignment of the kings tends to vary, but that's something where if we look at the whole concourse of magical writing through Europe, there's a lot of things where things get copied in different ways, and so stuff changes and assignments change. But what's interesting to me with the four kings is sometimes they are talked about in ways that treat them as demons. Sometimes they're talked about in ways that describe them in sort of a negative way, but in places where we'll talk about devils and we'll talk about infernal spirits, the kings can be mentioned along with them, but they're described with different terminology. So, like in the Book of the Offices of Spirits, it talks about four demon kings, but then it talks about the three devils, and that all the devils are sworn to the three devils. And so basically you have the three chiefs being described as devils, and the infernal spirits being described as devils, but the kings aren't described that way. The kings are given a lot of very negative, bad things that they're associated with, but they're still talked about separately from the devils. In Agrippa, the kings are not the same as the four princes that rule in the infernal world. The kings are simply upon the four angles of the world. And so there's definitely a way in which the language used to describe them separates them from the rest of the infernal spirits. But the way the hierarchies describe them, they're put right in there in the overall command of the infernal spirits. And again, it's going to vary a little bit from text to text as to how exactly they fall out. But the way that I tend to interpret it and the way that I tend to work is the idea that the four kings sort of rule the basic spaces of creation. And this is something where it's pretty separate from what our modern worldview is. But if you look back into a biblical worldview and you look at the Catholic worldview, and as I describe this, I'm looking at a replica of an old medieval map. There's this concept that directionality and lineage are things that are incredibly important for understanding the nature of things, the nature of a people, the nature of a place, and what powers are related to that, what their characteristics are. And so if we go back into Genesis, there's this idea that the world is divided up amongst the sons of Noah, and different kingdoms and cultures descend from different sons of Noah. And this becomes an important part of how the world was mapped for centuries, that the world was mapped out based on the way that things were divided amongst Noah's sons. And the world was understood as having different characteristics in different places, and that the peoples of those places had different characteristics and natures and behaviors based on how they descended from the sons of Noah. A related concept to this is the idea that a given direction is ruled by a particular power. And within that direction, there are things of a certain nature. And so everything that's connected to that nature in the world, whether it's coming from that direction or not when we experience it, is still ruled by that power in that direction. So when we look in a modern magical perspective, when we draw out a circle and we say we're doing the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, and we go to each quarter and we trace our pentagrams, we're not intending to banish the thing that is in front of us in that quarter. We're intending to banish all of reality in that quarter. And so everything that is ruled by the nature of the East is affected by that banishing. Everything that's ruled by the nature of the West, when we turn to the West, is affected by that banishing. Because the idea is that the space isn't simply the space that we're looking at, but rather the overall nature of what is Eastern or what is Western or Southern or Northern, and that those things are ruled by particular spiritual powers, and so particular things within the world share in that nature. So anything that we're trying to call in or shape or develop, or anything that we're trying to push out, is going to have its flow either restricted or permitted based on the rulership of that direction. And so in my concepts, my understanding of the kings, they are essentially the spirits that work on the terrestrial level of creation in order to control that flow. Now, this concept of the terrestrial level of creation also mandates that we understand sort of how the Ptolemaic view of existence worked. And so this gets to one of those things where I was saying earlier that different things can be true at the same time. So if we're flying a spaceship, then our solar system is heliocentric. And so we need to navigate based on the idea that the sun is at the center. But if we're doing magic, then our solar system is geocentric. And we need to navigate based on the idea that the Earth is at the center. And with the Earth at the center, we have the terrestrial altitude, we have a watery altitude, an airy altitude, a fiery altitude. And then beyond those altitudes, we have the world that is the lunar sphere and above. We have the heavens. These altitudes that are elemental are within the sublunar sphere. And then we have within the terrestrial sphere, the chthonic world, and then beneath the chthonic world, below the terrestrial sphere, we have the infernal world and the abyss. And so when we're understanding how creation plays out and how forces and influences of the spirit world and of divinity move through the world, then we're looking at how a particular nature exists as a ray coming from the heavens down through the celestial spheres and then down through the elemental spheres and into the chthonic world, into the infernal world, and then is ultimately lost in the abyss. And as we do that, then we also look at how those different forces play out, not just at those different levels, but in any given direction of existence. And so the terrestrial sphere is where we encounter the most physical things, the things that we actually interact with on a material basis. And so when something is manifesting in the northern part of the terrestrial sphere and it's manifesting a ray of influence from the zodiacal spheres coming through, reflected off of Saturn into the northern part of the terrestrial sphere, then maybe we're dealing with something that has to do with a confounding or restriction of the flow of material resources. And so we begin to understand creation as these different directions and these different levels of manifestation and these different lights from the heavens interacting with each other in order to shape creation. And that the specificity of how these things move together has to do with how these different spiritual powers and spiritual beings weave the interplay of these things as they're coming into being and weave the interplay of these things as we're interacting with them. And so if we want to do something about things that are manifesting from the north, then we have to call upon the king of the north and gain his permission to either allow those things through or to prevent those things from coming through. When we want to work with a particular spiritual power, something that Stephen Skinner has pointed out has been somewhat lost to us is this idea of the importance of directionality in Western magic. And if we really spend time exploring the Grimoires, and if we just look at Dr. D's work, then we can see the idea that spirits appear from a given direction. And it's something that's actually pretty common, but just the Grimoires that sort of survived to impact the Golden Dawn and impact Lima, it wasn't as highlighted in those Grimoires. So it was something that wasn't as much of our awareness up until recently. But in most of your earlier Grimoires, directionality is incredibly important because the planets, while the planetary powers can manifest in all the directions, they have directions that they're primarily associated with. And so calling spirits that are ruled by that particular planet generally they're going to be called under the influence of the king of that direction. And when we receive that spirit, we are supposed to look to that direction as that being the direction where the spirit's coming from. So if we understand the spirit is actually traveling from that direction, and I think when we talk about the aerial spirits, that's where it's most clearly illustrated, because in Liber Juratus, it talks about conjuring the particular winds, because the aerial spirits ride on and are driven by those winds. And so we conjure the wind of a particular direction in order to draw the aerial spirit of a particular direction. And so if we're going to allow those things in and allow them to work in the terrestrial sphere, the king of that direction has to be engaged in order to do that. So in my personal working, what I tend to do is I will call upon the overarching divine powers. Generally, I'll call upon Hecate as an overall gatekeeping force. I'll call upon my ancestors as guides and as assistants. And then I'll call upon the archangel that rules the power that I ultimately want to work with. From there, I move to calling upon the king of that direction, because that king can allow the spirits that I want to call in to work with me. The king also, by virtue of having a hierarchical rulership in that direction, can manage and control how those spirits work. So the angel call doesn't necessarily have to directly get involved with policing what an infernal spirit is doing, because the king sort of permits the spirit to work in one way or doesn't permit the spirit to work in another way. And so you're able to work within that same hierarchy that the spirit is part of in order to manage how the spirit's working, even though you have your other spirits as assistants in that regard.
To that point, BJ, what are your thoughts on the way a grimoire like the Heptameron is laid out, where there are no four kings of the four directions mentioned in the Heptameron, and even though like drawing spirits into crystals, which heavily relies on the hours and the angels of the hours kind of has the four kings, they're not mentioned anywhere. However, each day of the week in the Heptameron has angels, quote unquote, of the north, the south, and the east, and the west. Do you think that by working in that directionality of the specific angels of each direction of each day, that fulfills that kind of spiritual access? Or do you think, and kind of hints to like the winds as you're talking about with the Liber Juratus, or is there something missing? Or I just love your thoughts on that.
I tend to try not to jump into the area of something's not there because it's a blind, or something's not there because the systems are broken and incomplete. In the case of the Heptameron, while it is one of my favorite grimoires and it becomes sort of like the basis on which I build a lot of my other work, I think that the Heptameron is so rich and has so many things in it that it references and so many things that it points to as far as areas of magic and magical knowledge, but things that are just not explored and not actualized within the Heptameron itself. And when we look at the Retziel texts that the Heptameron is part of, the whole names of the sun and the moon and the seasons and all of those elements that are built up in the Heptameron, there's so much more to the magic of time that's present in some of the other Retziel texts. And the Heptameron recognizes the importance of both time and space and direction and working with the spirits, but there's so much more to it than what's included there. So I think because we can see that the parent texts that are providing the basis for some of the Jewish traditions in the Heptameron have more than what the Heptameron has, we can assume that there are other parts that are potentially workable with the Heptameron, but are not necessarily in the Heptameron itself. Now, with that said, I think the way that the conjurations are structured, where we have these directional angels and we have the directional Bible verses or prayers that are used in the higher spheres, it does work that directionality. And so you can work the Heptameron without necessarily calling the four kings. But if we look at the Clavis Inferni, which is basically mostly a forgery based on the Heptameron, I say that because it tries to present itself like some old text, but it's clearly someone from the period in which it was put together, putting together a text based on the Heptameron and adding some pieces to have kind of a cool showpiece. It tries to work the four kings back in. I think the Clavis Inferni, again, has like a lot of things that it touches on and addresses, but doesn't explore. And it provides some cool information that we can kind of add to our other work, but it's something that really needs to be fleshed out. And so I think you could very easily tie the four kings into Heptameron work but you could work the Heptameron without doing it. I think one element of why that works is you're working with the aerial spirits in the Heptameron. And so those aerial spirits can travel on the air, they can move through the winds, they can do their work on that level. And so maybe they don't need the permission of the kings on the terrestrial layer in order to come in. But I think having them work through that permission, particularly for material things that are being requested of them, can kind of help gain greater access into that particular level of creation. So I think it's something that might not necessarily be needed as far as adding it in. Because we're working with aerial spirits, we can work with it the way that it's described in the Heptameron, that those spirits can work on that level because they're traveling on the winds. They don't necessarily need the permission of the terrestrial kings to come in and work with us. But I think if we work through that permission and work through that authority of the kings, then we can increase how those spirits are able to work and manifest on a terrestrial level. But it's not necessarily something that has to be done. There are directional powers that are involved working on a higher level in the Heptameron itself. So it's something where we can use it in an additive fashion, but we don't have to necessarily use it in an additive fashion.
You kind of touched on your own personal practice and using and engaging with the specific king of a direction, and then, of course, engaging with a specific archangel as well. And that kind of touched on two different things that we hear a lot in terms of the Grimoiric and Solomonic communities, quote-unquote, which is different techniques of engaging with spirits and how there's a, quote-unquote, thwarting angel technique, and using a specific angel for a specific spirit. Dr. Thomas Rudd took this to a very fully developed length in his version of the Goetia, which kind of interestingly combines the Heptameron and the Goetia and matches the 72 spirits that are listed in the Goetia to the 72 Shemhamphorash angels. But that's one technique, and then another technique is the hierarchical technique. So having a king, for example, engaged with to therefore send a lesser, quote-unquote, I'm using these terms with a full amount of flexibility here, a lesser spirit to, or a spirit under its domain to fulfill a specific request of the magician. So there's the hierarchical command, there's the thwarting angel command, and you've referenced both in your own personal practice. So is this kind of a false dichotomy where people might, want to rely on one or the other solely, whereas in reality it might be far more flexible to just, use both as they're needed?
I think, yes, it's a bit of a false dichotomy. There's some areas where I think we try to remove some of the dichotomies and some of the divides in spirit work where they can be useful to understand and categorize things. But I think ultimately our actual engagement needs to be more organic. And so while we can kind of remove some of the dichotomies in order to create that more organic engagement, it's useful to have them there in order to understand the different types of spirits and why sometimes the interaction needs to differ from one group to another. I think in terms of this idea of hierarchical working versus a thwarting angel working, I think it's a much more fluid gray area than something where we can fully divide it out. I know Jake likes to talk about it as the hierarchical sense is something that is much more in line with a pagan view of thinking, and the thwarting angel sense is more in line with a monotheistic view of thinking. And I love Jake's work, and I think Jake is an awesome guy. And in most things, I end up agreeing with him a lot. I think it's useful to have that divide somewhat to introduce the ideas, but I don't think that it plays out so much that way when we start looking historically, because Elizabeth Butler, in her book Ritual Magic, points out that this concept of thwarting angels is something that we can see back into pre-Judaic Near Eastern religious traditions with working with planetary spirits. And so that there are these sort of divine spirits that rule the planets, and then there's more terrestrial spirits related to the planets, and that you can call upon the more divine spirit to control the more terrestrial spirit. And so it's something that before there's monotheism, we have that practice in place. We have documentation that that was the way in which spirits were worked. So I don't think it's something where we can divide it out so much as one school of thought, another school of thought, or one religious modality, another religious modality. I think if we look at the Testament of Solomon, which is sort of the, quintessential thwarting angel example, the thwarting angels are never actually used in the Testament of Solomon story. The demons present who the angel is that can thwart them, but Solomon commands the first demon based on an angel, and then he commands the rest of the demons based on the demon before that demon in the hierarchy. So he works with both methods at once. And I think as we look through a lot of texts, we start to see that. People talk about Dr. Rudd as the example of the Goetia adding in these thwarting angels, but Ashing Tashan points out that you have the angels in the names in the circle, and so you could interpret that as those angels being involved in that sort of process of them being there to help control and manipulate how the spirits are working. At least that's my interpretation of things that he said in the Solomonic group on Facebook before. There is also, if we look at the Heptameron, which is obviously one of the sources for the Goetia, then the Heptameron is very clearly set up with the idea that we're calling upon an archangel initially, and then we're calling upon a host of archangels with that archangel, and then we call upon a king and that king's ministers, and the king's ministers either go and do the work or their subservient spirits go and do the work. So we have the idea of having a hierarchy that involves an overarching angel and host of angels, and then we have a king and a subservient spirit to actually work for us. I think the Heptameron is sort of interesting in that perspective because while there's a tendency now to think of the aerial spirits as being more or less demons, in some of the Latin texts they're actually referred to as angels, or they're just referred to as spirits. So they're not specifically demonic in the sense of being devils. But the Heptameron's invocations, or the conjurations of the Heptameron, very clearly look like they're set up for conjuring devils. And so my interpretation of that is that there's probably a layer that you can take the Heptameron deeper in order to conjure more infernal spirits, which seems to be what the Goetia of Solomon does. And based on the relationship of the texts, to me that suggests that this thwarting angel idea is something that would have been influencing the thought of the development of the Goetia of Solomon. Conversely, if we look at the Book of the Offices of Spirits, the Book of the Offices of Spirits opens up talking about the four kings and talking about Lucifer. And when it talks about Lucifer, it says, Lucifer is the father of all devils. He may not be called, for he is in the depths of hell. Yet by him, as by Tantavalarian, other devils may be conjured and bound, for all devils do reverence and worship to this devil Lucifer. So there's very much this idea that it's through the command of the chief of demons, or the chief of the devils, that the infernal spirits can be called. And then it goes on to talk about the four kings and how they have their ministering spirits, and that you conjure their ministering spirit in order to work with the king. And then if we look at the Book of the Danelle, then those same ministering spirits are sent out to go and call upon whatever spirit the magician is actually trying to work under the authority of that king. So as we're kind of looking at the texts that all feed into each other, then we see an overlap and a bleeding together of these techniques. So while it's not as common to see one grimoire utilize all of the techniques together, the overall textual tradition is utilizing all of the techniques together. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Testament of Solomon, both techniques are utilized together there. I think another interesting example of that where the two techniques work together is the Abramelin. A lot of people don't talk so much about how the sacred magic works. They just talk about the retreat. But the core idea of the Abramelin is that the angel comes and teaches you the sacred magic. And what the sacred magic is using the angel to call upon the chiefmost demons. Then you use those demons to call upon lower demons and bind them, and then lower still demons and bind them, and then ultimately your familiars. And so you're working with an angel in order to call upon and command an initial group of demons. And then from calling upon and commanding that initial group of demons, you're able to use those demons to conjure lower and lower demons until you have the actual ones that are going to work for you, and until you have bound all of the ones that you choose to bind in a pact in service of the magical squares. So there's an example there of a relatively, I would say, important grimoire, which is combining the thwarting angel and the hierarchical techniques. So I don't think it's that revolutionary or unusual to combine them. I just think that they're things that didn't come through as cleanly to us in the later grimoires, And I think, as Jake points out, neither system comes through cleanly in the later Grimoires. If we're looking at the Bibliothèque Bleue period and the Grimoires then, it's very much just names of God, prayers, call your spirit. You don't have the thwarting angels being used. You don't have the demonic hierarchies being used. The only text where you're really seeing those demonic hierarchies being used is the Grimoire Verum. And so I think both techniques were kind of lost, but I think both techniques ultimately need to come back together and be worked together as opposed to us treating them as purely separate techniques.
I'm really glad you mentioned, too, Frater Chassan and the work of drawing spirits into crystals, because on page 174 of your book, you mentioned that, sometimes when we think about things like the crystal ball or a specific apparatus like the triangle or the circle, that these things can be used, perhaps, kind of intergrimoirically. So you mentioned on page 174 of your book that, quote, circles are symbols of infinity and triangles are symbols of manifestation and interaction. And, for example, you mentioned using drawing spirits into crystals can be used for possible work with chthonic or non-angelic spirits. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, so on the way to elaborating with that, it's okay, I want to note that for people that are interested in the idea of using the art of drawing spirits into crystals for working with non-angelic entities, Rufus is in the process of republishing his Modern Goetic Grimoire, which was the follow-up to the Modern Angelic Grimoire, which basically is a text about using that. So that, I believe, will be coming out soon. With the concept of working with these spirits, I think you could straight up use the process that is outlined in Art of Drawing Spirits into Crystals because the table has the four kings on it. It ties into being able to work that spiritual modality. You would just have to add a layer of conjuration for those spirits as well. I think when we start talking about associating the crystal ball or associating particular apparatuses or apparati with a particular type of spirit, then what we miss is that in a given grimoire, maybe something is used one way, but that we might see that thing used another way elsewhere. And so I think we really need to kind of pare down the technology and explore the individual pieces of it and how they relate together. I feel like I might be missing part of your question there, though.
Just to follow up on that, I remember, for example, in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, Dr. Stephen Skinner mentions that one can use the goetic circle, but inside the circle, so inside the protective barrier itself, one could use a crystal on a table of practice, and according to Dr. Skinner, when the spirit manifests inside the crystal, it is an image of the spirit, not the spirit itself, since the protective circle has presumably been traced with a consecrated iron blade, but that you could have multiple loci of manifestation. So you could have potentially, and I'd love your thoughts on this, a triangle outside the circle, which is never mentioned in the Heptameron, but it is mentioned in the Lemegeton's Goetia. But then inside the circle itself, you could have a use of a crystal on a table of practice.
One of the things to consider there, I think Joseph Peterson mentions this in his edition of Lemegeton, is that the idea of a glass vial or a crystal as a scrying tool is something that is fairly ubiquitous in the Grimoire tradition, to the point where there's some places where it's potentially not mentioned because it's assumed. When we look back into the Hygromantia, there are so many examples of that in the Hygromantia, and then in the texts that intervene between the Hygromantia and the late Grimoires, that it's something that while we sometimes associate it with 18th, 19th century versions of conjuration, it's something that crops up throughout the Grimoire tradition consistently. So I think when we talk about the idea that we have a triangle outside of the circle and the spirit is conjured to appear in that triangle versus a crystal that's in the circle and an image of the spirit is appearing in the crystal, I find that we're splitting hairs in a way that it's hard to really define what is the actuality of what's happening there. I think if you're seeing the spirit in some way, then you're seeing the spirit in some way. I don't think that the spirit is materially building an actual body in the way that a human being is. I think that the spirit is manifesting as a particular presence that our senses interpret in a given way. And whether we're interpreting that as something that's manifesting just before us in the triangle or we're seeing it manifest in the crystal, I don't think the mechanics of that are dramatically different, especially when we get into how scrying tends to work, with the idea of uniting some element of our perception with the crystal as sort of a bridge for observing something that is potentially remote from us or separate from us. So I think sometimes we get a little bit too concerned with how we're defining the manifestation of the spirit. I think we would be better served by looking at the effects of that manifestation. If we're asking the spirit questions, are those questions that we're able to go back later and confirm? Is it information that's actionable that we're able to use and then go get good results from using that information that we gain from the spirits? If we're asking the spirit to do something for us, is that something that we're asking the spirit to do happening? I think those are greater measures for whether or not we are actually calling upon the spirit correctly than whether or not we see a goblin show up in front of us. I've never been too hung up on that element. That said, I've definitely had things where things have appeared and where I've been able to see things very clearly, both in a crystal and not in a crystal. And I think you can, if you're concerned about the location in which the crystal is, whether or not the circle is somehow blocking out a particular level of manifestation, most people's working spaces are small enough that you could put the crystal outside of the circle and still scry in the crystal. So I think there's a lot of room to play with that in different ways. I think the circle that's on the table of practice, though, is kind of interesting as a piece of technology, because I don't know that Rufus still uses this term to describe it, but back when he was first working that system, before he was in the OTO and the AA and doing all the more contemporary magic stuff, he used to call his table of practice his manifestation engine, because it was able to produce such great effects in terms of bringing into his life the things that he wanted to bring in. To me, I think it's a good nickname for the table of practice, because you're sort of mapping out layers of spiritual manifestation in the table of practice. So personally, when I'm working with the table of practice, I'm not as concerned with whether or not I have some protective barrier between me and whatever spiritual forces I'm conjuring, because I feel that the image on the table is containing and manifesting that spiritual force, regardless of what type of spiritual force it is that's being conjured. I think there's a lot of ways to work where that kind of external barrier around the space may or may not be as necessary, depending on how the space is consecrated or depending on what model or methods you're using.
To that point, BJ, you offer readers this fantastic delineation in your book, Living Spirits, about this wonderful gray area where you can experiment. And of course, if there's a grimoire, to follow that grimoire and show as much fidelity to it as you can. But then also finding out what works for the individual magician. And you delineate a beautiful ritual where you specifically focus on an aerial king from the Heptameron, but instead of going through this, what I consider kind of quote-unquote the middle part of the Heptameron, these very heavy, very lengthy exorcism of the spirits of the air is the technical name. You borrow from, create this ritual engaging with that same king, but from the Theurgia Goetia of the Lemegeton. And you share with readers about how this is very effective. Can you just kind of share with the listeners about what kind of led you to combine different elements from different grimoires to specifically work with this aerial king?
Well, I think part of it for me is that the aerial kings, in my experience, it's not like working with the infernal spirits. Their presence is very different. The way they work is very different. The overall nature that I experience working with them is very different. And even in the books that describe them, they're described as being different. They're not described as being on that same level. So I feel that some of the language that's used in conjuring the infernal spirits is a little more aggressive than is needed with the aerial kings, because they don't need to be bound in quite the same way. They don't need to be bound quite as aggressively. And, I mean, depending on what your relationship is in terms of the spirits that you're working with, then you maybe don't need to be as aggressive with the infernal spirits either. But if there's not some other relationship there that's kind of managing your interaction with the infernal spirits, then it may be a good idea to be as aggressive as is historically recommended. But the aerial spirits are different. So my experience of them is that they're spirits that are part of this same world that we're part of. They're just operating on a slightly higher altitude than we're operating on, which actually puts them closer to the angelic realms than we are. So I think that while we can't quite conjure them exactly the same way that we conjure the angels, then we don't have to go as heavy-handed as we would if we were conjuring the devils. And so I found that taking this approach gives sort of a more middle approach, and it works fairly well in my experience. It's not something where you're conjuring the aerial spirits to a visible manifest appearance. You're just kind of conjuring them into presence and then binding them to go do whatever it is that you need them to go do. It's a little bit more of a casual conjuration, but still has enough elements of a formal conjuration that you're still moving through something that falls into a conjuration ritual. So I have found that it works rather well. I've gotten good results using it, and my experience of those spirits has been such that I've never felt like I needed more than that in order to properly control them or properly stay safe while working with them.
BJ, to that very point, since you were talking about, aerial kings, for example, and the four directions, and I know definitely in Grimoire traditions, but also in Lodge traditions, there's this focus on the elements and the elementals. And you obviously write about this in your book, Living Spirits. Can you share with the listeners who might not be too familiar, like what place do the elementals, quote unquote, have in magic or in Grimoire magic? Can the influences of the elementals be applied to magical workings or grimoires that don't specifically mention the elementals?
I think the elementals are really great spirits as far as a starting place for people, because the elementals want to work with people, and they're generally friendly, accessible spirits. Like, they want to show you what their world is. They want to provide things for you. They want to stand with you. And that's something where that comes up repeatedly in the way that they're treated textually, as far as kind of what they do, how to work with them, where they fit in with the grimoires. I think that the elementals are kind of interesting because they're not the same as when we look at the spirits in the grimoires and we can say, all right, you have the aerial spirits that live in the air. You have the terrestrial spirits that are in a terrestrial realm. The Solomonic grimoires don't really deal with watery spirits, but the Falastine grimoires have some of those. The grimoires have the fly-the-lights, the spirits that reside in the darkness. And there we're kind of looking more at where those spirits live and how we interact with conjuring them, more so than what their powers are. Whereas when we're looking at the elementals, they live in that particular elemental realm, and their powers are specifically tied to that elemental realm because they're the workmen. They're the beings that take the various elemental natures and they structure creation out of them. So when we look at things from an alchemical perspective and we look at the elements as being part of the building blocks of the fundamental natures of things, these are the beings that are shaping those blocks and providing those blocks and moving them into where they need to be in order to build up the things in creation. And so they also have the ability to kind of move around how those blocks are fitting together, move around how the different elemental forces are flowing and how they're being shaped in order to change our experience of those elemental forces and therefore change our experience of the things that are manipulated or controlled or ruled by that elemental nature. So when we call upon them, they are spirits that we can call upon for fairly manifest things. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting with that is we can call upon an elemental spirit because we want to manifest something specifically related to that element in a physical sense. So if you're trying to build a fire, then you can use the prayer of the salamanders to call upon the salamanders to help you build that fire. Conversely, you can also call upon them for things that are related to the element that they're connected to. So if you need coin, if you need money, then you can call upon the gnomes because money is related to the element of earth. So there's both the real manifest physical nature of their element as well as the philosophical nature of their element. The thing that's tricky with that is the elemental spirits are fairly simple spirits typically. And so even though you can deal with things that are philosophically under their rulership, you don't want to necessarily call them for really highbrow, complex, conceptual concepts. You want to call them for things that are fairly straightforward. Now, in terms of how they fit into the Grimoires, I think that's a really interesting question because the elementals come into play more in the Paracelsian model of looking at the world. For the most part, they aren't treated broadly in the Grimoires, particularly not the earlier Grimoires. The Grimoire Verum has the prayer of the salamanders, but doesn't address the other elementals. And so it's almost like they are something that's part of another parallel system of magical work. I think they can tie back to the Grimoires very easily, though, because if we're looking at the Grimoire structure in that Ptolemaic structure of the universe, then we're still dealing with the idea of moving spirits that are moving particular flows of force through particular places in order to manifest particular natures and particular things. And so we can call upon the elemental spirits to help with the physical shaping of how that is playing out. So it's something that we don't really see the Grimoires doing, and it's something that I've kind of gone back and forth with on presenting as a model for working. But when I was talking before about kind of calling upon divinity, then Hecate to open the ways in a general sense, the ancestors to guide the spirits, the archangel, the king, and then ultimately the spirit that you're working with, then you could take that a step further and call upon the spirit you're working with. Also pray the prayer of the elementals to call the elementals into attendance for the rite and explain to the spirit what you want the elementals to build, and have the spirit provide the things that the elementals need in order to build that thing for you, and then ground that manifestation into a more material manifestation by working through the elemental spirits, since that's ultimately what their job is. I think if you're working that model, then you would probably want to work with the particular king that's associated with the direction that element is associated with. I try to be careful about not saying that the kings are kings of a given element, because the directionality and the elements are not purely united, but there's still assignments of the elements to particular directions. And so you could still take the king of that direction and the element associated with that direction, call upon the king, and have that king command how the elementals are working with the things of the nature of that direction. So I think there are ways to do it, but I don't think it's something that is attested in the Grimoires, so it's something that would be arguably an innovation.
All right, listeners, my notebook was definitely on esoteric fire after chatting with BJ, which is only the first part of a two-part discussion, and I think his book, Living Spirits, is at once both practical and also thoroughly researched to reflect the history of magical tributaries, and you really walk away from engaging with BJ with a sense of a person who has done the things he writes about, someone who's very successful in banishing the armchair and stepping into the circle. And in addition to that, you also get the sense that BJ is encouraging every listener and reader to do the same. So stay tuned for the next part of our conversation with BJ coming soon. And Glitch Bottle patrons and supporters can enjoy exclusive content and monthly benefits. And a huge thanks of support to each and every one of you, as monthly supporters are the driving force in fueling the show in new and interesting ways. If you would like to jump on the Glitch Bottle caravan with us, please visit patreon.com/glitchbottle to find out more. And as always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube and listen on Spotify, Spreaker.com, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a review on iTunes is always most welcome. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.